Good morning, everybody, and I am delighted to welcome you to today's CPD, which is on the carbon cost of your materials and how to measure it across the EU using life levels. So we're delighted to welcome Stephen with us today, Stephen Barrett. He is joining us from the Irish Green Building Council, which I would strongly advise you to join, in fact, if you're not already a member. Stephen has joined himself in 2020 to work on the whole life carbon projects that they have there. He's working on Levels, which is the EU initiative to promote a common language around the environmental performance of buildings. Stephen is very much capable of speaking to us on the subject. He actually has a master's in sustainability and adaptation in the built environment, and his thesis was focused on life cycle analysis. So with that said, I'd like to welcome Stephen and to invite him to start his presentation. Thank you, Stephen.
Good morning. Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. I'm Stephen, and I'm going to talk about whole life carbon. So IGBC is part of a World Green Building Initiative to drive awareness about our building materials and why it's important that we understand more about them. Decarbonising buildings is not only about not burning fossil fuels in our homes, it's about how we build them in the first place. And the Building Life campaign is here to highlight the embodied carbon in the materials that we use in such huge quantities. Yeah. So buildings are responsible for so much of our emissions. They account for half of everything that we mine out of the ground, around a third of our emissions, and a third of what we throw away. And when we talk about whole life carbon, we're referring to the carbon emissions embodied in the building materials, as well as those caused by heating and cooling of our building stock. Today, I'd like to go over a couple of things. First, the embodied carbon that is baked into our building materials, and take a look at what that looks like on a per kilo basis. And second is a look at the European standard for assessing the total volume of carbon in a building project. Regulatory requirements are appearing all the time. This is quite an interesting website available at the World Bank. It looks at carbon pricing initiatives around the world. And if you play around with the timeline at the top there, you'll see the rapid growth in implementation. If you slide it back to 1990, you'll see just Finland and Poland on that map. Currently, the French government is leading the way in adding carbon requirements to procurement procedures. So in the future, if you want to win infrastructure or building contracts in France, this is going to be crucial. In France, you can't make an environmental claim without you having the data to back it up, without an EPD to back it up. Holland requires whole life carbon assessment for planning permission. It's been written into the new London plan, and we're seeing this start to proliferate in a lot of major cities around the world. Finland is aiming for net carbon neutrality by 2035. China announced at the end of last year it has a net zero trajectory plan for 2060. The US just rejoined the Paris Agreement. And here in Ireland, the Climate Action Bill is challenging the nation to reduce all carbon by 50% this decade and reach zero by 2050. So you can see how getting a better understanding of carbon emissions and their sources, all emissions I should say, is only going to become more important. So this is the same data, only showing the growth in the proportion of global emissions that are under some kind of pricing regime. It's up to around 23% today, and it's only going to continue rising. So the aim of the Building Life campaign is to reduce embodied carbon by 40% this decade and work towards zero carbon by mid-century. So it's in line with most countries' targets. But currently, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive only looks at the energy use of our buildings, the operational energy. Both the EPBD and the EU Directive on Building Products are up for consultation this year. So we're trying to get them to look at this bigger picture. which shows us a building doesn't just appear. Its whole life cycle is much more than just that operational energy. And although operational energy is usually the greatest emitter in a building's life cycle, as we build better, more efficient buildings, the significance of the other aspects of the building grow to become just as important to address. We'll come back to this circle later in the presentation. So I modeled a typical concrete block house, and this is what a new A2 rated building will look like today. I'm going to show you a few charts, but they're all based on this same data, just displayed in different ways. Today, an electric heated home with an A2 BER rating of 50 kilowatt hours, primary energy per square meter, will have a carbon cost of around 9 kilos CO2 per square meter per year. This factors in electricity generation, transmission, and the fossil fuels still used in the grid. In Ireland, the National Planning Framework has a target of 550,000 new homes by 2040, and these should all perform to that A2 rating. And as the grid decarbonizes and becomes more efficient, we'd expect this 9 kilos per square meter per year to kind of taper off. So you can see here, this is the same data as the previous chart. That 45%, which was operational energy, is at the top there. And beneath, we have all the other carbon emissions associated with the building. And you can see most of the remainder is in manufacturing materials. And that's what I'm going to focus on next. There are other considerations too, but today I just want to talk about the materials themselves. So again, the same data. This chart shows the emissions for every year over a modeled 50-year life cycle. The yellow at the bottom there is your annual electricity bill, but it's the big carbon burp, as it's known, at year zero, that's the elephant in the room. That's made up of manufacturing materials, what we call the A1 to A3, bringing them to site, the A4, and construction itself, the A5. And the problem is these emissions happen now, they're not spread over years in the future with the benefit of a decarbonizing grid. So it actually looks more like this. You can see the same 50-year life cycle at the bottom. As carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere, it has this cumulative effect. So while we would expect that dotted line to flatten in reality with the decarbonizing grid, we're setting ourselves a starting position of well over 40 tons, and this is a small building that I've modeled, on 15, 20, 25,000 homes per year. So you can see why this needs addressing. So this is the problem. We're not really aware of our own impacts. So I'm going to try to relate them to something we're all more familiar with. We all know that driving petrol cars causes carbon emissions. Everybody knows that now. So I'm going to try and relate building materials to driving a car. The average car sold in Ireland in 2019 produces 122 grams of CO2e per kilometre it's driven. So we'll take a look at how our building materials stack up against this. So here's our car, 0.12 kilos of CO2 per 1 kilometre. And this is 1 kilo of concrete. It's roughly the same as driving your car, 840 meters. I should say that throughout all of this, there will be variance. Just as there's variance across different models of cars, there'll be variance in different types of concrete and all the other materials we use, depending on the primary energy mix used in their manufacturing, the volumes of raw materials, distances between material sources and processing plants, all these kind of. Everything I'm using here is an average drawn from groups of comparable EPDs or modeled using average background data. So a brick, just one brick, equivalent of driving almost 4 kilometers in your car. I'm told We use about 7 million bricks in this country every year, mostly imported. So that 250 million kilometers or more. And then you have the mortar to hold your bricks together. Every kilo of that, the equivalent of another almost 5 kilometers of driving in your new car. So you can see how this all adds up. And a lightweight concrete block, the most common thing we use for building homes in Ireland, the same as 46 kilometers in a car. You can see what I'm trying to do. Just show you the things we take for granted and give you an idea of what it really takes to bring them into existence and get them ready for site. Back to our car. Now this slide highlights the importance of recycled content. Just a kilo of a structural steel beam can require more than 3 kilos of CO2 emissions to produce it. But it can be reduced quite drastically if we can increase the recycled content, or if we look for alternatives that come with other benefits. Sequestration. A kilo of timber will sequester over a kilo of carbon dioxide. It draws carbon atoms out of the atmosphere and uses them for growth, leaving oxygen atoms where they are. Nature already does carbon capture and sequestration. We just need to scale it up. Back to our car. Aluminium for facades, windows, that kind of thing. It's great for weatherproofing, and it's light and it's infinitely recyclable, but the production method requires huge amounts of electricity, even when some of the content is recycled. It also comes with some other nasty side products too. There are great pools of contaminated, sludgy red wastewater dotted around the world that no one can find a use for as a result of our aluminium demand and production. But it's all out of sight, so it's all out of mind. Back to our car. Last one. Insulation. So wood fiber insulation. It has about the same carbon cost as EPS to produce in its harvesting and manufacturing, but it also absorbs carbon as it grows prior to that harvesting. This cubic meter here can balance out the equivalent of 860 kilometers of driving emissions, even after you take into account the emissions incurred in producing it. So we need to think about storing that for as long as possible, reusing it after the building is deconstructed, because if it's incinerated, then that sequestration is gone and we're back to square one. So it's as if it never happened. So to think more about buildings as materials banks as well as functioning buildings. They're also banks of materials, if you like. To think about this in the context of a circular economy. That's a whole other subject. I'm not going to go into it, but it's just something to be aware of. Now, everything I've just shown you has been simplified. There could be 100 other reasons for choosing or not choosing a specific product. They all have the property you need to take into consideration. But I just wanted to clearly show that difference in one property, carbon cost. All the materials of the properties will also influence the decision to. This final chart is at the other indicators we consider when assessing environmental impacts. It shows the performance of an external wall using CLT in and the same area using filled cavity creep blocks in maroon. This one's in percentages, so the worst performing one for each of these categories is shown as 100%, and the other is relative to that. So you can see in the first pair where it says GWP, global warming potential, this can be reached by almost 70% by using CLT when compared to concrete block wall. It performs better in most environmental impacts, but by means all, you can see the ODP, the ozone depletion potential, and the photochemical ozone accretion potential are both greater with CLT This is probably to do with the glues in the laminating processes. I just wanted to point out that it's not always 100% clear cut what the best alternative is. My point is that we need to think about all of these things in the round. Carbon is usually a good indicator for the other impact, but not always. So we do have to tread carefully and consider what our priorities are. If carbon's the priority, and it usually is, then the CLT looks good. And of course, it does have carbon sequestration. You can see that on the right there, the bio CO2 storage, which of course the timber will have in the CLT, but not in the concrete blocks. So when's the best time to think about these decisions? The answer is as early as possible in the project, before anything else gets locked in. This chart relates to cost, but exactly the same principle applies when you're thinking about carbon savings too. The earlier the design direction is set and everyone involved is aware and on board, then the greater the potential to reduce carbon. Trying to work and change later will be more difficult, possibly less successful, and there will be more resistance, as nobody likes having to rework because a plan's changed. So the message is decide early and set out with these numbers in mind that I've just shown you. I should say that we at IGBC are planning on launching a tool this summer that will help you with these early design decisions. You only need to know basics like floor area and number of stories at very early design stages to start seeing the likely carbon cost of complete buildings based on different common material choices. So keep an eye out for that. It will be free. It will cover common build-ups in Ireland and a few kind of alternatives, just to give you an idea of the kind of savings that can be made. So how do you do it? Where do you get this information? As I said, everything I've ran through here is based on data, and I've used averages, either the average from a group of EPDs or a result of a generic LCA study of that particular material. Using an average at the beginning of your building design, before you know who the specific supplier will be, can give you an indication of what your final result is likely to be. The best source, but data varies hugely across manufacturers, across regions, and across time. So there's a few things that you need to keep in mind. Best source of data on a build material or product is the EPD, the environmental product display. And this is what we would like to see building designers and specifiers demanding from their material suppliers. We want these to become a real differentiator in the marketplace, something that really affects the decision process. Now, the most accurate information you'll get will be from an EPD that covers a specific product from a specific plant. So use that if it's available, once you know that that product will definitely be used on site. Failing that, there are EPDs that cover groups of products, either all produced by one manufacturer, where they've used a similar process in all their different products, or EPDs used by trade bodies that produce them to cover the products for all their members. But there is less accuracy and less certainty here. As you zoom out away from that specific product in that specific plant, then you lose the accuracy. The other thing to consider is time. How old is your EPD? EPDs have a validity of 5 years. Before that, or rather after that, they're deemed to no longer truly reflect what's going on in the production process. So it's important that your EPD is up to date and reflects as closely as possible the actual production process of the product that you're using. You can look for them in a number of places. There's a couple of places here, or just use Google and put in the product and add EPD on the end. We're currently working to digitize a lot of the results that are held within EPDs and get them into a machine readable format so that we can build tools to make this kind of carbon accounting, if you like, simpler, quicker and easier and more consistent for everybody. So keep an eye out for that. If Eco Platform are leading on that, so if you go to the Eco Platform website, maybe sign up for their mail outs, then you'll be kept up to date on that. If you are a manufacturer in Ireland, there is support to develop EPDs from Enterprise Ireland. And the other thing I wanted to mention to get you started on embodied carbon is this circular ecology website. If you go there and download their free ICE database, the inventory of carbon, I can't remember what the E stands for, maybe emissions. But yeah, they have a database that's downloadable for free. Just a really useful Excel spreadsheet. It'll give you all those averages that I've been talking about, and lots of links to background info, lots of links to EPDs of specific products, and you can start to build your own models from there. So the number of EPDs being produced by manufacturers is growing at a rapid rate. You can see here the growth over the last 10 years from virtually 0 in 2011 to 10,000 or more today. This is in response to some of the legislation I mentioned at the beginning, but also the market demanding this information. So when you're specifying something, particularly if it's in a large volume, and you've seen it in this presentation, please take the time to ask suppliers to also supply EPDs so you can understand what the emissions involved in processing that material to bring it up to the standard you needed were. The more we ask, the more they're going to provide them, and this will become an area of competition within each industry. If we don't ask, things will just remain the same. It'll be business as usual. So when you have all this data on carbon intensity of the processes that produce the products, you can then begin to build an inventory for your product and quantify the carbon for the whole life cycle. And this is what I want to talk about for the second part of this presentation, how to do this, what framework to use, and what else you'll need to consider. And that is levels, the levels framework. So the levels framework was introduced to try to give sustainable buildings across Europe a common language and a common set of metrics. You see lots of examples of good practice, but they've all been approached in different ways, with reports on different aspects, so it can be very difficult to compare and understand what works. Levels is about capturing what's important in sustainable building projects and reporting on it in a consistent way so we can learn from one project to the next. It's built on 6 macro objectives, and you can see them here. These have been identified as the key headlines, if you like, things we need to be focused on. There's greenhouse gas emissions across the whole life cycle of the building. That's number 1 there. Circularity in our materials, water usage, occupant health and well-being, future adaptation as market demand changes. This is key to ensuring long-lived and useful structures. And finally, life cycle costs and value opportunities. Now, in turn, each of these 6 is supported by indicators to help guide and focus a design process. These indicators are measured using common metrics across projects, which allows for benchmarks to be developed and comparisons to be made. By using common metrics, we ensure we're addressing the same challenges. We can compare and evaluate multiple design approaches, and we can learn from one experience to inform the next. Key one for us looking at whole life carbon today, and the one that's getting all the attention in legislation around the world, is indicator 1.2, life cycle global warming potential. So we use data from indicator 1.1, the energy model, or a BER. 2.1, bill of quantities for your materials. 2.4, which is about how you take building apart at the end of its useful life, and possibly 6.1 at the bottom there too, the life cycle costing. We use all those indicators to feed into a carbon inventory, similar to the one I mentioned earlier, to build a model of a project, a carbon model of the project. Now, it's not compulsory to carry out studies across all of those indicators. The framework is organized into 3 levels, and it allows for a choice in how advanced in your reporting you want to be. You can choose to only work at level 1 or go further up to level 2 or 3 and use the manuals accordingly. So they're quite detailed manuals on how to carry out a level 2 and a level 3. Level 1 though, well, I should say the 3 levels reflect kind of key stages in a project lifecycle. Level 1 kicks in at the concept design of a building project. Here it's just about informing yourself about each of the indicators, doing the reading to understand why that indicator is considered important. It's very accessible entry point for the use of each indicator and the basic concepts behind each one. And the outputs are purely qualitative. So it's just reading and understanding what's important. Level 2 takes place at the detailed design stage of a project. It provides a common basis for quantifying the performance of building designs. For each indicator, common units of measurement together with reference calculation methods are provided. So you can use the manuals to produce consistent quantitative assessments based on your designs. And level 3 is the as-built and in-use stage of a building project. Here you collect actual data on the actual as-built performance of the building and compare it to level 2 to discover what really worked in your project. So level 3 is about reading the invoices, doing the data logging, and looping back to level 2 to find out how good your level 2 was essentially. So indicator 1.2, that's the one we're focusing on, emissions across the life cycle. That's the key one for measuring whole life carbon using that carbon inventory. Because buildings are almost always unique, they have multiple materials and process inputs, they're multifunctional, they usually continue releasing emissions while they're in use, they last for decades, they're site specific, they're assembled locally. Because of all these reasons, an EU technical committee, TC350, developed standard EN 15978 to try and put some organization around measuring all this. Standard breaks down the life cycle of the building into its component phases. And this is probably the one key slide in today's presentation. So if you take away anything today, take away this. If you go away and you look up EN 15978, then you'll learn everything else from there. The picture in the middle there is a finished document, which is a really accessible introduction to the standard, and the RICS document is a more diligent, more detailed Q&A, if you like, of the standard, because you will have questions once you get into it. So the stages of a building life cycle, they look something like this. Let's see. So in the beginning, we have raw materials extraction and transport to a factory where we do our manufacturing. A study to here of just the materials would be a cradle to gate study. That's from the cradle of the earth to the gates of the factory for going out to site. Next, you have the transport and the construction. So you will see studies that are A1 to A5, which would be a study of the carbon emissions from cradle to practical completion of a building. Of course, that's not the end of a life cycle. We have use, maintenance, and repair. B1 use, if you are using refrigerants in the building, this can be very significant. There's not a great deal of research into this, and it is something that needs looking into further. Maintenance and repair are both pretty insignificant in the general scheme of things. Also in the use stage, you have replacement, refurb, operational energy, and operational water use. B6, operational energy, is the key one here. Obviously, that's your 50 or 60 years of heating and cooling, as well as everything else, your lighting as well, and everything else that you're running in that building. And then, of course, there is the demolition stage. So at this point, you would have a cradle to grave study, the whole life cycle of the building. But there is one further step, which is the recycle and reuse of the building. So we have an inventory that looks like this. The EPDs, or generic numbers, will inform A1 to A3 on the left there. An energy model for a large project, or maybe just a BER rating for a house, will inform the B6 in the middle near the bottom there. And these are the two most significant modules in almost all whole life carbon analysis, certainly in all that I've come across. If you remember at the beginning, the model I showed you at the beginning, it had 45% in the A1 to A3 and 45% in the B6. For all the other modules, you can use either actual data if you know it, or you can measure it, or generics, average rule of thumb, that kind of thing. They can be applied to give you that fuller picture. Here's just a breakdown of what we mean when we talk about embodied and operational carbon. A1 to A5 is often referred to as upfront embodied, a bit like a down payment that's done, it's already happened by the time you get the key in the door. B1 to B5 is embodied during the use phase, and module D will always be a negative number, as it refers to the elements of the building which have a use outside of the life of the building. So, for example, a steel beam may be used again in another building, which substitutes the need to manufacture a new steel beam for that new building. These benefits are always reported separately, and they're not deducted from the total because they occur outside of the life cycle of this particular building. So this is a table from RICS that I always include because it's really useful. It lays out the modules across the top, and there are building elements down the left with the totals on the right. Really handy for tracking everything, for seeing where you've got your data in and what's still missing. So you can see in the green box, the overall whole life carbon total for this particular project, 3.9 million. And then divide that by the 5,000 square meters in the top left-hand corner to get your CO2 per square meter. So this is a pretty average performing example. So just a quick reminder of the two key standards, EN 15804 for materials and products, and EN 15978 for the building level. So targets, what does good look like? REBA is looking for less than 800 kilos CO2 in 2020. We're in 2021 now, so we need to be getting below that and reducing that every 5 years. It's not clear if this includes MEP and refrigerants, which are significant, but currently the best data we have for that is estimates of around an extra 60 kilos per square meter for just for the A1 to A3 for MEP. CIBSE in the UK are due to publish guidance on it in August, but we would expect it to be something like 60 kilos per square meter. And this is a common problem you find when you're trying to compare one project with the next. What is the scope? What's included in your project and what's left out? LETI, the London Energy Transition Initiative, I hope you've heard of them. If not, they do have a lot of useful resources on their website, so I'd encourage you to go and take a look at that too. So they're looking for 600 kilos just for stages A1 to A5. So that's the upfront embodied carbon. It's a slightly different scope, so you can see, again, comparing one to the next can be tricky. But in some ways, this is more sensible as trying to predict what a building will be doing in 20, 40 or 60 years, and what repair and replacement methods will look like then. Can be challenging, to say the least, and you won't find out if you're right unless you live to 100. So here are a couple of really good websites to help you start looking at different materials and looking at materials in a different way. Building specifiers do have a big role to play here. If you go to the pyramid there, it's a really great little tool. You can, at the bottom of that website, you can start doing some basic calculations to see the differences that you can make. And it's just laid out in a really nice visual way. Finally, here's a shameless plug for the course that I do at IGBC. This looks into whole life carbon in a lot more detail and how to use tools to do that analysis. So once you've identified the hotspot in your analysis, then you can begin to look at different approaches. What can you do differently to reduce that whole life carbon number by focusing on the largest contributors, if you like, in your inventory to try and bring that number down. So yeah, if you're interested, then by all means, on that link, and Alice at the IGBC will be able to help you. And that's it from me. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I have so many questions. You've covered off a lot of them. I might actually look at the recording at a later date as well. I forgot to mention that the recording will be circulated, or the video of your presentation, because there's so many resources there that are also important. I was wondering, before I get into the questions from attendees, about the EPDs. Is there any sign at all of, I suppose, I mean, I really support the list of EPDs and it makes such sense. Is it any sign at all of this becoming mandatory, that we need to have regard to this?
Of it becoming mandatory, we would like it to be. There is the European directive on materials in buildings is up for consultation this year. Whether or not they'll be mandatory, I don't know, but I think they should be. I think they should be much more disclosure around this kind of thing. I personally push for and advocate a traffic light system similar to what you see for food labeling, so that everybody from the beginning of the planning right through to the guy who unwraps the material on site can see the environmental impact of that product. Because currently EPDs exist on PDFs. They're actually, those numbers that I'm quoting are often given in scientific format rather than just standard numbering. So you need to really know what you're looking at when you look at an EPD currently. It needs simplification and it needs bringing out into the light. So yeah, I want to see it. I want to see it on labeling, and there are arguments against it, but I haven't heard a strong enough argument against it yet.
Yeah, and as you say, we've so many houses to build in this country, and the materials portion of a house takes up so much of the carbon footprint of it. It makes sense to know what you're doing, doesn't it? It's common sense.
Yes. Okay. And the other thing with that is, just as we're building more efficient homes, we're using more material in them to get that operational energy down. So we're not looking at what we're doing. We're robbing one hand, pay the other. It's not very good way of saying it, but you know what I mean.
And as you say, as the electricity sector becomes more decarbonised as the years go by, it makes sense to really concentrate on what we're doing at the moment, because that will, to a large extent, sort of take care of the operational emissions as time goes by. Now I'm waffling on, I should get to the questions. I'll start at the top. So hi Stephen, can hardwood oaks still be considered within this regard and as part of the material mix, question mark? For example, the Coolatin oak timbers were used constructing the likes of Trinity College and Westminster Abbey, and their use offers both structural capacity and assists with carbon neutrality.
Yes, yeah, more wood as much as possible. I think we should be trying to build with things that grow rather than things that we dig out of the planet.
Okay.
So
okay.
Yes, definitely.
And hardwood oaks, Stephen, any comment on that?
I'm not an expert.
Yeah, I suppose we better be careful where they come from. Lovely. And hi, Stephen, at the start of your presentation, you mentioned that France are world leaders in sustainability award criteria on infrastructure projects, and that any claims have to be backed up with data. Is there any case studies available that you might be able to point to, please?
Let me think. You mean specific to France?
I think so, but maybe just case studies on infrastructure projects that you might be able to refer to that we could look at maybe for guidance.
I could probably send some round later. I could speak to Marion in the office, who probably will have some. Yeah,
that's perfect. If you wouldn't mind getting that to us, maybe we could pass that on. Thank you very much. The next question is, would you consider that the enforcement of EPDs for materials will fundamentally change the design and materials we would be allowed to use? So that's a good one.
Yeah, well, the idea really is, if you're asking material manufacturers to produce EPDs alongside products, then obviously they're going to want to look good to sell more. So you create competition to produce a better looking EPD alongside your product in order to sell more product. So if you demand an EPD, and this is why I think specifiers need to be asking for them, then it becomes an area, it becomes a selling point of the product. So if you can get manufacturers competing in that area, they will. I mean, currently, the way the world works, it works on money. So they will produce the cheapest thing that they can, unless you're willing to pay a premium. We need to stop thinking just in terms of financial cost, but also in terms of environmental cost as well. And it's not, it's not the material manufacturers doing anything wrong. It's just that is what business currently is. So we need to create different areas of competition, not just finance, and that's what an EPD will do. It'll compare two products, and you can see which one was the more environmentally damaging to produce. And obviously, all else being equal, you'll choose the less environmentally damaging one. So you create an area of competition there.
Very good. Another question is, to date, has there been research carried out on the capital value cost of implementing a carbon reduction, say for a typical 4-bedroom house? Research on the cost of implementing. So I think, is that retrofitting perhaps, that question, implementing a carbon reduction? I think that might be a retrofitting question, but do you want to have a go at answering that?
I think, sorry, say the question again.
So it says,
because I think it's more about the cost of building one, is it?
Yeah, I think it might be actually. The capital value. So to date, has there been research carried out on the capital value cost of implementing a carbon reduction, say for a typical 4-bedroom house? I think that might mean, I mean, is it cheaper or more expensive to build a house?
I think there's been a lot, and generally, the answer is, if you start out at the beginning with it in mind, and you don't try to switch to it later, then the cost needn't be any greater than building in a more conventional way. It's about setting off in the right direction. And the other point to make on that is obviously economies of scale. So I think currently, as we understand it, if you set out in the same direction, in the right direction, it needn't cost more. The other benefit is if more people do it, then we can start to see economies of scale, and we see costs coming down. So I think that's what the research points to at the moment. Conventional looks cheaper because of scale at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
But if you approach it with this in mind at the beginning, then you can build more green for a similar cost.
Okay, certainly solar as an example, solar PV has come down by 300% in the last maybe 5 years, I'm guessing. I'm just judging it on what the quotes I got from my own house. And I suppose the government are saying now, aren't they, that they need to, us, all of us need to retrofit 50,000 houses a year.
Yeah.
So we're certainly likely to see clustering, shall we say, very large clustering of retrofits. So that's going to play out right under our noses over the next few years.
Yeah, and that is why I really think that EPD data is important right there up on the label, because a lot of it's going to be done by small cottage industry, if you like, and there won't be analysis done ahead of time. So, this data needs to be visible to the guy on site doing the job.
And actually, leading on from that very thing, another question's come in is, how can we trust declarations? Like, as an example, car emissions were false. And I suppose what that question is relating to is, how verifiable are the EPD declarations, I think, really. Could you speak on that for a minute?
Yeah, so an EPD is carried out by a third party. So a manufacturer employs an LCA consultant to come into their manufacturing process and understand it. And then the consultant goes away and models that process in LCA software, which is not quite the same as what we're looking at when we talk about that building level. This is a more granular component level. So it's not done by the manufacturer, it's done by an independent LCA consultant, and then it is third-party verified by another LCA consultant. So yeah, it's as good a data as we can get.
Okay,
and
very good.
Sorry, the other thing to mention is that EPDs all conform to this standard EN 15804, which sets all the rules for carrying out an LCA of a particular product. Part of it is that third-party verification.
Okay, very good. Another question, I've never seen so many questions. This is clearly a really hot topic, and one that we should definitely come back to for sure, seeing this activity. Re-commercial office new build. Are you aware, Stephen, and if don't worry if you're not, are you aware of any whole life cost models that we could reference or use as a template? Sorry, and that also refers to carbon pricing. So any models that we could use as a template for commercial office rebuilds?
Yeah, if you go to oneclicklca.com or org, I think it's com, oneclicklca.com, and if you sign up there, they have templates of exemplar buildings in their software, and you can look at them for free. They also have a free version of their software called One-Click LCA Planetary, which would give you the A1 to A3 of various materials. So I would encourage you to have a look there in the first instance. It's a really good website anyway for lots of background information and further reading. The Whole Life Carbon course that I do at IGBC is based on their software. The free tool that we will be launching later this year is based on one of their tools. So I would go there if I was you to look for the kind of the practical side of how to do it. I'm quite aware that today has been all quite theoretical.
No, today's been brilliant, Stephen. And I would actually also just mention from my own point of view, as a member of IGBC myself for years, I've had so many resources from you guys that have helped me. They're not all technical. Some of them are, they're easy to understand, they're straightforward, but there's also a lot of technical advice. and sharing information across different groups. That really helps everybody out, and that's really where we're at the moment, is sharing information. So I would really advise anyone, I suppose, who's interested in this as well, to go to igbc.ie, sign up as a member, and all work together, because that's the only way we're going to get out of this, is to share information, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And we're just coming to the end. Somebody made a comment there, with over 180,000 vacant homes in Ireland, has anyone measured the carbon footprint of new versus rebuild? I suppose getting to the point of, should we be using all these empty houses instead of building new? That would be
absolutely.
That would seem to make sense. I always remember Pat Barry saying, he says it a lot, it's kind of like, you get into the detail of embodied carbon and operational carbon. He says, just stop and think whether you need to build the thing to start with. Do you need to build it, or is it there already? Or can you use what's there already?
Yeah, completely. Greenest building is one you don't build.
Yeah, the greens, or one that's there already that you can adapt. Okay, so I think, there might be one more question. No, I think we one more, and I'll squeeze it in right at the end, if that's okay. Land costs are encouraging increasing building heights, which is not conducive to the utilisation timber structural elements. Where is the joined up thinking at government and EU levels, i.e. are there extensive grants for material research, etc.?
I don't know. I don't know is the short answer. I haven't caught up with the consultation on the building materials side of things yet. So I don't know. I'm not in a great position to answer that. Yeah,
I mean, certainly from our point of view at the SESI, because I'm in the sustainability working group, we are working on that a little bit, doing our best. The building surveyors within the group are, for sure. It's not my thing. And if there's any particular questions on that, please do contact sustainability@scsi.ie, because the more I think we all know what people's issues are, and the more we can discuss it and share information and know what the issues are, the more we can step towards figuring them out. So if there's any questions here that either haven't come up or haven't been answered, please contact that email address and let us know, so we can sort of put it on the long list of other things that we are working together to figure out as members. So anyway, with that said, I'd like to, just before we finish off, I'd like to thank Stephen very much indeed for presenting what has clearly been one of the most engaging talks that I've been involved with. Anyway, I've never seen so many questions. Some of them I haven't got to. So clearly it's a subject that a lot of people are interested in. Before I go, I'd like to also encourage any members that haven't signed up to Surveyors Declare to please consider doing so. Even if your firm hasn't signed, if your firm has signed up, perhaps you might consider signing up as an individual as well, and putting your name to it. The recording will be made available to all attendees, and it was really good, with lots of useful websites and whatnot that I'll be going to look at afterwards. So thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you very much to everybody who came along today, and have a lovely day. Thank you.
Thank you.